In case you're wondering why I'm on my way up, I figured out that the view's a whole lot better on the roof.
I thought nobody was allowed up there.
He slipped his phone back into his pocket and pulled out a single key, which he held flat in his palm.
That's true, technically speaking.
So you have friends in high places, huh?
Low places.
He said, returning the key to his pocket. We messed that up last night.
The basement, remember?
This time she laughed. Such a good actress.
What's up there anyway?
The sky.
You get keys to the sky?
She said, and he knitted his fingers together, lifting his arms above his head in a stretch.
It's how I impress all the girls I meet in the elevator.
Well, it's working.
Watching him over the past week, studying him from afar, she'd imagined he must be shy and unapproachable. But sitting here now, the two of them grinning at each other through the dark, she realized she might have been wrong. He was funny and a little bit odd, which at the moment didn't seem like the worst kind of person to be stuck with.
Although, I'd be a lot more impressed if you could get us out of here.
I would too.
He said, shifting his gaze to scan the ceiling.
You'd think the least they could do would be to pipe in some music?
If they're planning to pipe in anything, hopefully it's some cool air.
Yeah, this whole city's like a furnace. It doesn't feel like September.
No, it's hard to believe that school starts tomorrow.
Yeah, for me too. Assuming we ever get out of here.
Where do you go?
Probably not the same place as you.
Well, I hope not. Mine's an all-girls school.
Then definitely not the same one. But I'd already figured that out anyway.
What do you mean?
Well, you live here.
In the elevator?
In this building.
So do you.
I think it would be more accurate to say I live under this building. But I'm betting you go to some fancy private school where everyone wears uniforms and worries about the difference between an A and an A minus.
She swallowed hard, unsure what to say to this since it was true. Taking her silence as an admission, he tilted his head as if to say, I told you so, then gave a little shrug.
Where's the he said?
Cute.
I'm going to the one up on 112th that looks like a bunker, where everyone goes through metal detectors and worries about the difference between a C and a C minus.
I'm sure it won't be that bad,
She said, and his jaw went tight. Even through the darkness, something about his expression made him seem much older than he'd looked just moments before, bitter and cynical.
Made him look 42, in fact. The school or the city?
Doesn't sound like you're too thrilled about either.
He glanced down at his hands, which were resting in a knot on top of his knees.
It's just, this wasn't really the plan. But my dad got offered this job, and now here we are.
It's not so bad, really. You'll find things to like about it.
It's too crowded. You can't ever breathe here.
I think you're confusing the city with this elevator.
The corner of his mouth twitched, but then he found it again.
There are no open spaces.
There's a whole park just a block away.
You can't see the stars.
There's always the planetarium.
Are you always so relentlessly optimistic, or just when it comes to New York?
I've lived here my whole life. It's my home.
Not mine.
Well, doesn't mean you have to play the sullen new guy card.
It's not a card. I am the sullen new guy.
Give it a chance, Bartleby.
Owen?
I know, but you're sounding just like Bartleby from the story. Herman Melville, author of Moby Dick.
I knew that. Who's Bartleby?
A scrivener, sort of a clerk. But throughout the whole story, anytime someone asks him to do something, all he says is, I would prefer not to.
Yep. That pretty much sums up my feelings about New York.
You would prefer not to. But but that's just because it's new. Once you get to know it more, I have a feeling you'll like it here.
Is this the part where you insist on taking me on a tour of the city and we laugh and point at all the famous sights and then I buy an I Heart NY t-shirt and live happily ever after?
The t-shirt is optional.
For a long moment, they eyed each other across the cramped space. And then finally he shook his head.
Sorry, I know I'm being a jerk.
It's okay. We can just chalk it up to claustrophobia or lack of oxygen.
He smiled, but there was something strained about it.
It's just been a really tough summer. And I guess I'm not used to the idea of being here yet.
His eyes caught hers through the darkness, and the elevator felt suddenly smaller than it had been just moments before. Lucy thought of all the other times she'd been crammed in here over the years, with her dad with his newspaper folded under his arm, always standing near the door, ready to bolt, Her mom, wearing a thin smile, seesawing between amusement and impatience with the rest of them. The twins grinning as they elbowed each other, and Lucy, the youngest, tucked in a corner, always trailing behind the rest of the family like an ellipses at the end of a sentence. And now here she was, in a box that seemed too tiny to hold so many memories, with the walls pressing in all around her, and nobody to come to her rescue. Her parents were in Paris across the ocean as usual, on the kind of trip that only ever included the two of them, and her brothers, the only friends she'd ever really had, were thousands of miles away, at college. The whole family was now hopelessly scattered, and from where she sat, all alone in New York, Lucy felt it deeply just then, as if for the very first time. The bigness of the world, the sheer scope of it. Across the elevator, Owen rested his head against the wall.
It is what it is.
He murmured, letting the words trail off at the end.
I hate that expression. Nothing is what it is. Things are always changing. They can always get better.
He looked over, and she could see that he was smiling even as he shook his head.
You're totally nuts. We're stuck in an elevator that's hot and stuffy and probably running out of air. We're hanging by a cord that's got to be smaller than my wrist. Your parents are who knows where. My dad's in Coney Island. And if nobody's come to get us by now, there's a good chance they've forgotten about us entirely. So, seriously, how are you still so positive?
Lucy slid out from the wall, folding her legs beneath her and leaning forward.
How come your dad's in Coney Island?
That's not the point.
For the roller coasters?
He shook his head.
The hot dogs? The ocean?
Aren't you at all worried that nobody's coming to get us?
It won't help anything worrying.
Exactly. It is what it is.
Nope. Nothing is what it is.
Fine. It's not what it isn't.
I have no idea what you're saying.
Or maybe you just prefer not to.
They laughed. The darkness between them felt suddenly thin, flimsy as tissue paper, and even less substantial. His eyes shone through the blackness as the silence stretched between them, and when he finally broke it, his voice was choked.
He's in Coney Island because that's where he first met my mother. He bought flowers to leave on the boardwalk. He wanted to do it alone.
Lucy opened her mouth to say something, to ask a question perhaps, or to tell him she was sorry, a word too small to mean anything at a moment like this. But the silence felt suddenly fragile, and she could think of nothing else worthy to break it. His head was bowed so that it was hard to make out the expression on his face, and she felt useless sitting there without any idea of what to do. But then a faint knock sent her heart up into her throat, and his eyes found hers in the dark. The sound came again, and Owen stood this time, moving over to the door and pressing his ear against it. He knocked back, and they both listened. Even from where she was still sitting numbly in the middle of the floor, Lucy could hear the muffled voices outside, followed by the scrape of something muddled. Sound effects. After a moment, she rose to her feet too, and without a word, without even looking at each other, they stood there like that, shoulder to shoulder, like a couple of astronauts at the end of a long journey, waiting for the doors to open so that they could step out into a dazzling new world.